Can't sleep again? Just have a lot on my mind.
The Sterling mansion sat on 11 acres overlooking the Hudson River, a monument of glass and pale stone that seemed to announce, before anyone even stepped through its doors, that the people inside had never wanted for anything. Alexander Sterling had inherited the house along with the company, the name, and the weight of expectations that came with being the only son of the late Richard Sterling, founder of Sterling Global Holdings. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comment where you are watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. At 34, Alexander was worth more than some small nations. He commanded boardrooms with a single sentence, closed deals that made headlines in the Wall Street Journal, and had, according to every gossip column in New York, the coldest heart in Manhattan. Women had tried for years to thaw it. None had succeeded, not really. Not until a quiet, unassuming young woman named Naomi Carter started polishing the silver in his dining room 3 mornings a week. Naomi was 26, with warm brown skin, tired eyes that still managed to smile, and hands roughened from years of work most people in that house would never understand. She had grown up in Savannah, Georgia, raised by a mother who cleaned hotel rooms for a living and a grandmother who preached that dignity wasn't something anyone could hand you or take away, no matter how little you had. Naomi moved to New York at 21, chasing a nursing degree that stalled out when the bills piled higher than the financial aid ever covered, and she'd been working ever since to keep her mother's lights on and her little brother in school back home. She cleaned houses. She waited tables. She sent whatever she could spare back to Savannah every month, rain or shine. When the agency placed her at the Sterling estate as a live-in housemaid, she thought her prayers had finally been answered. Steady work, a roof, and food that didn't come from a dented can. She did not expect to fall in love with the man who owned the house. It happened slowly, the way most real things do. She noticed it first in the small hours of the morning, when Alexander came down to the kitchen unable to sleep, and found her already awake, ironing shirts or preparing an early breakfast. He would sit at the counter, not the dining table, the counter, like a man trying to remember what it felt like to be ordinary, and they would talk, about nothing important, about the rain, about a book she was reading, about his father sometimes, in the careful, guarded way men talk about wounds that haven't closed. "You're the only person in this house who doesn't want anything from me," he told her once, at 2 in the morning, staring into a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "I want you to sleep," she said. "You look terrible." He had laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh that surprised even him, and something shifted between them that neither was ready to name. Naomi knew better than to hope. Men like Alexander Sterling did not marry maids. They married women with pedigrees, women whose fathers sat on the same boards, women who understood the difference between salad forks without being taught. She kept her feelings folded small and hidden, the way she folded his shirts, careful not to leave a single crease that might give her away. But love has a way of showing on a person's face, no matter how hard they try to hide it. And Eleanor Sterling, Alexander's mother, missed nothing. Eleanor Sterling ruled the family with the same precision she once used to run her late husband's charity foundation. Total control, wrapped in silk gloves. She was a woman who believed in bloodlines the way other people believed in scripture. To Eleanor, the Sterling name was not just a name, it was an institution that had to be protected, polished, and passed on to the right kind of woman. She had one other child besides Alexander, a daughter, Scarlett, 29, sharp-tongued, and beautiful in the practiced way of women who had spent their whole lives being photographed. Scarlett adored her brother fiercely, in the possessive way an only sibling sometimes does, and she shared her mother's conviction that nothing, and no one, beneath their station belonged anywhere near the family they had built. It was Scarlett who first noticed the way Alexander's eyes followed Naomi across a room. "Mother," she said one evening, swirling wine she wasn't really drinking, "I think Alex has a thing for the maid." Eleanor's fork paused mid-air. "Don't be absurd." "I'm not being absurd. I'm being observant." He asked her opinion on the Whitmore merger last week. He asked the maid. Eleanor set her fork down slowly, the way she did before making a decision that would reshape someone's life. Then we will need to remind him who he is. From that night on, life for Naomi changed. Small things. At first, her schedule doubled without warning, her breaks vanished, her meals reduced to whatever was left over after the family ate. Then it grew crueler. Eleanor would summon her at midnight for tasks that could easily wait until morning, simply to remind her of her place. Scarlett took a particular delight in misplacing jewelry and demanding Naomi turn her room upside down looking for it, only for the piece to turn up in Scarlett's own handbag days later, with no apology offered. "You people always think you can climb," Eleanor said to her once, in the cold, clipped voice she used for people she considered beneath conversation. "Do yourself a favor, and remember your station before you embarrass yourself." Naomi said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was armor. But at night, in the small room off the kitchen that the staff called home, she cried into a pillow that had heard more of her secrets than any person alive. She never told Alexander. She didn't want to be the reason for a war inside his family. She didn't think she had the right. While Naomi endured her quiet suffering, another woman was busy constructing a very different kind of future. Isabella Reyes was 31, stunning in the sculpted, expensive way that came from good genes and better surgeons, and utterly, dangerously broke. She came from money once, old money that her father had gambled away in a string of failed ventures, and she had spent the last decade trying to marry her way back into the life she felt entitled to. She had dated 2 minor celebrities, one senator's son, and a hotel heir, each relationship ending the moment her intentions became too transparent to ignore. Alexander Sterling was, by far, her most ambitious target. They had been introduced at a charity gala 8 months earlier, and Isabella had worked with surgical precision ever since, appearing at the right events, laughing at the right jokes, positioning herself as exactly the kind of woman Eleanor Sterling would approve of. Eleanor, in fact, adored her. Isabella understood old money instincts better than most people born into it. She knew which fork to use, which causes to champion publicly, which opinions to keep to herself. What she didn't have was Alexander's heart. He was polite to her, attentive, even, in the distracted way a busy man is attentive to an appointment he can't quite cancel. But he never looked at her the way she'd seen him glance, just once, at a family dinner, toward the maid clearing plates from the table. Isabella noticed, and Isabella did not tolerate competition, especially not from someone she considered beneath notice. She made her decision on a Tuesday night, alone in her apartment, staring at a pregnancy test she had bought but never used, an idea forming with the cold clarity of a woman who had run out of other options. If I can't win him with love, she thought, I'll win him with obligation. Getting the fake results wasn't difficult. A family friend who ran a private clinic, a generous donation to keep the paperwork discreet, and a carefully rehearsed performance of tears and trembling hands. She told Alexander over dinner, at the restaurant he always took his most serious dates to, watching his face carefully for the moment the news landed. "I'm pregnant," she said, letting her voice break exactly where she'd practiced. "I know this isn't what either of us planned, but—" Alexander went very still. Then, because he was a man who had been raised to believe that responsibility was the highest form of honor, he reached across the table and took her hand. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." Isabella smiled and thought, yes, together. All the way to the altar. The news reached Eleanor Sterling within the hour. Isabella made certain of that, calling her future mother-in-law before Alexander had even finished his entree. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and absolute joy. "A grandchild," she breathed into the phone, one hand pressed to her chest. Finally, a grandchild, and a Sterling heir. By the time Alexander arrived home that night, his mother and sister were already waiting in the drawing room, with champagne they hadn't waited for him to approve of drinking. "We're so happy for you," Scarlett said, hugging her brother tightly. "Isabella will make a wonderful Sterling." Alexander accepted their congratulations with the strange, hollow feeling of a man watching his life get decided by everyone except himself. He should have felt joy. He felt, instead, a heaviness he couldn't quite name, until his eyes found Naomi standing quietly near the doorway with a tray of glasses, her face carefully composed into the practiced neutrality of the invisible help. But he saw it. The flicker of pain before she caught herself. The way her hands trembled just slightly as she set the tray down. "Naomi," he said, before he could stop himself. "Are you all right?" Every head in the room turned. Eleanor's expression sharpened into something dangerous. "She's fine," Eleanor said smoothly. "Aren't you, Naomi? Go and prepare the good crystal. We're celebrating." Naomi nodded and left the room without a word, and Alexander watched her go with a knot in his chest he didn't have the courage to examine. The wedding was announced within the week. Eleanor, thrilled at the prospect of a grandchild and terrified of scandal should the pregnancy become public before a ring was on Isabella's finger, insisted on speed. 6 weeks. A ceremony grand enough to fill the society pages, fast enough to outrun any whispers. Alexander agreed to all of it with the numb compliance of a man doing what was expected rather than what he wanted. In the weeks that followed, the Sterling estate became a factory of wedding preparations. Florists and caterers and dress fittings, Eleanor barking orders like a general, Scarlett fussing over guest lists and rehearsing toasts designed to charm the press. Amid all of it, Naomi worked harder than ever, invisible in the way staff are trained to be invisible, present in every room and acknowledged in none. Except by Alexander. He found reasons to seek her out. A question about the seating chart she had no business answering. A request for tea he could have made himself. An excuse to walk past the kitchen at the hour he knew she'd be there. Naomi told herself, every single time, that she should discourage it. That every stolen conversation was a small theft from a woman who didn't deserve to be betrayed, whatever her methods of securing this marriage might have been. But she was only human, and his was the kindest voice in a house full of cruelty, and she found herself unable to turn it away. "You don't have to marry her," she told him once, unable to hold the words back any longer. They were in the garden, past midnight, the wedding only 9 days away. "If it's not what you want." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, moonlight catching the exhaustion in his face. "There's a child, Naomi." "My child? What kind of man walks away from that?" "The kind who deserves to be happy too," she said softly, and then, horrified at her own boldness, added quickly, "I'm sorry, it's not my place." "Don't apologize," his voice was rough. "You're the only person who's asked me what I want in months." They stood there, closer than propriety allowed, the air between them heavy with everything neither of them would say. It was Naomi who stepped back first, because someone had to, because she had watched too many maids in too many houses lose everything for less than this. "Good night, Mr. Sterling," she whispered, and fled before he could see her cry. Eleanor, watching from an upstairs window with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, saw enough of that exchange to confirm every suspicion she'd been nursing for months. The next morning, Naomi was summoned to Eleanor's study before dawn. "I want you gone by the end of the wedding," Eleanor said without preamble, not bothering to look up from the papers on her desk. "I've tolerated your presence in this house long enough. I see the way you look at my son. I see the way he looks at you. I will not have a servant destroy everything this family has built. Mrs. Sterling, I don't care what you have or haven't done." Eleanor's eyes finally lifted, cold and unblinking. "You will smile at that wedding. You will serve at that reception with grace. And the moment it's over, you will pack your things and disappear from this family's life forever. Do you understand me?" Naomi understood. She had understood, in some quiet corner of her heart. From the very first day she felt something bloom for a man who was never meant to be hers. "Yes, ma'am," she said, and left the room with her spine straight and her eyes burning. Scarlett found her later that day in the laundry room and, with the casual cruelty of someone who had never once been made to feel small, added her own contribution. "You know he's just being kind to you," Scarlett said, examining her manicure. "Rich men are like that with the help. It doesn't mean anything. Don't embarrass yourself thinking it does." "I don't think anything," Naomi said quietly, folding a shirt with hands that refused to shake in front of this woman, whatever they did later, alone. "Good," Scarlett smiled, sharp as glass. "Keep it that way, or my mother will make sure you regret it. Isabella, meanwhile, was discovering that maintaining a lie for 6 weeks was far more exhausting than she'd anticipated. She had to remember to avoid alcohol in public, to occasionally press a hand to her stomach with practiced wistfulness, to deflect Eleanor's increasingly specific questions about doctor's appointments and due dates. She had recruited her closest friend, Renata, as an accomplice. Renata's cousin worked at the clinic that had produced the falsified results, but even Renata was growing nervous. "This is insane, Isabella," Renata hissed at her one evening, the two of them alone in Isabella's apartment while wedding invitations sat stacked on the coffee table like evidence waiting to be filed. "You can't fake a pregnancy for 9 months. What's your plan? A miscarriage? A stolen baby?" "I'll figure it out after the wedding," Isabella snapped. "Once the ring is on my finger and the prenup is signed, it won't matter. Divorce laws favor the wife in a marriage like this. I'll be set for life either way." "And if he finds out before the wedding?" Isabella's jaw tightened. "He won't. Nobody suspects a pregnant woman of lying about being pregnant. It's the safest lie in the world." She didn't know, in that moment, that Renata's guilt was already beginning to eat away at her, a guilt that would, in the end, become the crack through which the entire truth came flooding out. The days leading up to the wedding blurred together in a haze of fittings and rehearsals, and Eleanor's relentless perfectionism. Alexander moved through it like a man sleepwalking, saying yes to floral arrangements and menu choices without really seeing them, his mind elsewhere, in a garden at midnight, in a kitchen at 2 in the morning, in the face of a woman he had no right to want. 2 nights before the ceremony, unable to sleep, he found himself once again in the kitchen, and once again, Naomi was there. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, not looking up from the dough she was kneading for the morning's bread, though her voice trembled just slightly. "I keep thinking," Alexander said, sitting heavily at the counter, "that I don't actually know what I'm walking into." Naomi's hands stilled. "What do you mean?" "I mean I've spent 6 weeks planning a wedding, and I still can't picture the marriage. I can't picture her, in this house, every day, for the rest of my life." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't even know why I'm telling you this." "Because I'm safe," Naomi said quietly. "Because I don't want anything from you." He looked up at her then, really looked, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "That's not true anymore, is it?" She should have lied. She should have laughed it off, made a joke, changed the subject the way she'd trained herself to do every single time this conversation threatened to become something neither of them could take back. Instead, exhausted from weeks of cruelty and heartbreak she'd been forced to swallow in silence, she told the truth. "No," she whispered, "it's not." The silence that followed was the loudest thing either of them had ever heard. Alexander stood, crossed the kitchen, and for one suspended moment, it seemed as though the entire careful architecture of both their lives might collapse into something honest. Then a floorboard creaked in the hallway, and they sprang apart like guilty children, and the moment shattered. It was Eleanor. Of course it was Eleanor. She said nothing that night, simply stood in the doorway, her face unreadable, and retreated back up the stairs. But the following morning, Naomi was informed that her duties would keep her confined to the East Wing for the remainder of the wedding preparations, far from any room Alexander might wander into. Eleanor was done watching. It was time to act. That afternoon, Eleanor called Naomi into her study for the second time in a week, and this time she was not alone. Scarlett stood beside her, arms crossed, and on the desk between them sat an envelope thick with cash. $10,000, Eleanor said, sliding the envelope forward. "Enough to disappear tonight, before the wedding, and never contact my son again. Or," she continued, before Naomi could speak, "you can refuse, in which case I will personally see to it that you never work in this city again. I know people, Naomi. I know judges. I know immigration officials. I know every hotel and household in a 50-mile radius that would think twice about hiring anyone I've blacklisted. Your choice." Naomi stared at the money, then at the two women watching her with matching expressions of cold expectation, and felt something inside her, something that had been bending under the weight of their cruelty for months, finally, quietly, break. "You think I want your money," she said, and her voice, for the first time in that house, did not shake. "You think this is about climbing, about scheming, about wanting something I don't deserve. I have never asked your son for anything, not once. I fold his shirts and I make his coffee and I keep his secrets, and in 6 weeks I have never once tried to take what isn't mine." She pushed the envelope back across the desk. "I don't want your money, Mrs. Sterling, and I won't be bribed into pretending I don't have a heart." Eleanor's face flushed with fury. "How dare you?" "I dare," Naomi said, "because I have nothing left to lose that you haven't already tried to take. Fire me if you want. I'll leave when Mr. Sterling asks me to leave, not one moment before, and not because you waved money in my face like I'm something to be purchased and discarded." She turned and walked out, leaving Eleanor speechless for what might have been the first time in her adult life. Scarlett, watching her mother's stunned silence, felt something shift in her own chest. Not quite sympathy, not yet, but the first small crack of doubt in a wall she'd spent months reinforcing. The night before the wedding, Renata sat in her car outside the Sterling estate for nearly an hour, unable to make herself drive away, unable to make herself go inside and say what she'd come to say. Guilt had been gnawing at her for weeks, not just about the lie itself, but about what would happen to a man who seemed, in every interaction she'd witnessed, genuinely decent, genuinely trying to do right by a child he believed was his. She thought of her own father, of the family she'd give anything to protect, and she thought about what kind of person she was becoming by helping Isabella destroy someone else's. She finally worked up the courage around 11 at night, slipping in through the staff entrance where she knew, from Isabella's careful reconnaissance, that a friendly housemaid usually let deliveries through even late. Instead, she found Naomi, sitting alone on the back steps, staring up at a sky she couldn't sleep beneath. "I need to see Mr. Sterling," Renata said, breathless, "but I don't know how, and I don't think anyone will let me near him tonight, and I don't have much time before I lose my nerve." Naomi studied the stranger's tear-streaked face, and, on instinct more than reason, said, "Tell me, I'll find a way to make sure he hears it." And so, sitting on the cold stone steps of the Sterling estate, on the eve of a wedding built entirely on a lie, Renata told Naomi everything: the falsified test results, the bribed clinic, the plan to secure a fortune through a fabricated pregnancy, the guilt that had finally become too heavy to carry alone. Naomi listened in stunned silence, her mind racing through the implications, not for herself, not even for the wedding, but for Alexander, who was, at that very moment, upstairs preparing to bind his life to a woman who had built her entire future on deceit. "I need proof," Naomi said finally. "He won't believe this without proof, and neither will his family. They'll say I made it up to stop the wedding." Renata pulled out her phone with trembling hands. "I have messages. Between me and Isabella, planning it. And my cousin at the clinic, she has the real results, the ones that were switched. It was enough. It had to be enough." The morning of the wedding dawned bright and merciless, the kind of perfect autumn day photographers dream about and brides pray for. The Sterling estate had been transformed overnight into a cathedral of white roses and champagne silk, 300 guests already beginning to arrive, camera crews stationed outside the gates to capture New York's society wedding of the year. Naomi had not slept. She had spent the hours before dawn trying to find a way to reach Alexander alone, but Eleanor, perhaps sensing danger in the air, had assigned her to the farthest reaches of the kitchen, surrounded by caterers and staff who left no opportunity for a private word. It was Scarlett, unexpectedly, who gave her the opening. Scarlett found Naomi near the pantry just after 9, and for a moment the two women simply looked at each other, the sister who had spent months tormenting her, and the maid who had never once fought back with anything but dignity. "I saw the way you spoke to my mother," Scarlett said quietly, "in the study. You weren't lying, were you? About not wanting anything." "No," Naomi said. "I wasn't." Scarlett was silent for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. "I've been horrible to you," she said finally, the words clearly unfamiliar in her mouth. I told myself it was because you didn't belong here, but really I think I was just afraid of what it would mean for this family if my brother chose someone we couldn't control. Scarlett. Naomi's voice was urgent now, aware of the ticking clock, the guests filling the lawn outside, the bride surely already being sewn into her dress. I need to tell you something, and I need you to believe me, even though every part of you has been trained to think I'm lying. She told her everything Renata had confessed the night before. Scarlett's face drained of color. That's insane. Isabella wouldn't. I have proof, Naomi said. Messages. A woman from the clinic who's willing to speak. Please, Scarlett. Whatever you think of me, your brother deserves to know the truth before he marries a lie. For one long, terrible moment, Scarlett stood frozen between two versions of herself. The woman who had spent months protecting her family's name by tearing down an innocent maid, and the sister who genuinely loved her brother and could not, in her heart, let him walk into a marriage built on fraud. The sister won. Come with me, Scarlett said. Now. They found Alexander in his dressing room, already in his tuxedo, staring at his own reflection, with the hollow expression of a man walking toward a life he didn't choose. He looked up in surprise as his sister burst in, Naomi close behind her, both women out of breath. What's going on? He asked, straightening. Alex, Scarlett said, and for the first time in years, her voice shook with something other than composure. You need to hear this before you walk down that aisle. Naomi stepped forward, and though her hands trembled, her voice did not. Isabella isn't pregnant. She was never pregnant. The test results were falsified, bribed out of a private clinic, and her friend Renata came to me last night, sick with guilt, ready to tell the truth. I have the messages. I have a witness. I have everything you need to see it for yourself. Alexander stared at her as though the floor had opened beneath him. That can't be true. Why would she? Money, Scarlett said grimly. A fortune, a name, a lifetime of security, bought with a lie. Alex, I know this is the last thing you want to hear right now, with 300 people on that lawn, but you need to see this before you say a single vow. For a moment, Alexander said nothing at all. Then he pulled out his phone with hands that were not quite steady and dialed a number Naomi recited to him, Renata's number, given the night before for exactly this moment. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Alexander's face had gone the color of ash. She's real, he said quietly. The clinic records, the messages, it's all real. He looked up, and something in his expression, grief, fury, and beneath it all, a strange, terrible relief, settled into resolve. Get my mother, he said, and get Isabella now. What happened next would be talked about in certain New York circles for years afterward, though the truth was carefully scrubbed from every official account the Sterling family's lawyers could reach. Alexander walked out onto the lawn in his wedding tuxedo, but instead of walking toward the altar, he walked to the small tent where Isabella waited in her gown, radiant and triumphant, utterly unaware that her carefully constructed future was about to collapse in front of 300 witnesses. Alex, she said, smiling as he entered, you're not supposed to see me before. I know everything, Isabella. The color drained from her face so completely that even the professional makeup couldn't hide it. I don't know what you're talking about. The clinic, Renata, the falsified results. His voice was quiet, controlled, but shaking with a fury he'd rarely allowed himself to feel. You lied to me. You manipulated my entire family. You were going to bind me to a fake child for the rest of my life to get your hands on my money. Alex, please, let me explain. There is nothing to explain. He stepped back, as though her proximity had become physically unbearable. This wedding is over. By then, Eleanor had arrived, summoned by a frantic assistant, her face a mask of confusion that curdled into horror as she pieced together the shouting she was hearing. What is the meaning of this? Alexander, there are 300 guests. There is no baby, Mother. Alexander's voice cracked, finally, under the weight of everything. There never was. Isabella lied. She faked the entire pregnancy to trap me into marriage. And you? His eyes found his mother's. sharp with an anger she had never once seen directed at her in his entire life. "You spent 6 weeks planning the wedding of the century instead of asking a single question." The lawn had gone deathly silent. 300 guests, dressed in their finest, stood frozen in a tableau of shock as the truth rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Somewhere near the back, a photographer, sensing the story of a lifetime, began quietly, discreetly, taking pictures. Isabella, cornered and desperate, made one final, catastrophic mistake. She turned toward the crowd, toward the cameras, toward anyone who might still be swayed by her performance, and screamed, "He's lying! Ask his little maid what she's been doing sneaking around this house for months. Ask him why he's really calling off this wedding." Every head turned toward Naomi, standing quietly at the edge of the tent, having followed Scarlett and Alexander in the chaos of the last 20 minutes. For one unbearable moment, the entire gathered elite of Manhattan society stared at the maid in her plain gray uniform, standing amid silk and roses and scandal, and waited to see what would happen next. Alexander crossed the tent and stood beside Naomi, not behind her, not in front of her, but beside her, in full view of every camera and every gossiping guest on that lawn. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "I have feelings for this woman, and unlike the woman standing in that wedding dress, she has never once lied to me, manipulated me, or tried to take a single thing that wasn't freely given. If that's a scandal, then let it be one." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor stood frozen, her entire understanding of the last several months rearranging itself in real time. The midnight kitchen conversations, the garden walk, her own cruelty toward a woman who, it turned out, had never once acted on the feelings everyone had accused her of having, until this very moment. Isabella, seeing her last card played and lost, burst into furious, undignified tears and fled the tent. Renata, who had arrived just in time to witness the collapse of her own deception, trailing after her with a mixture of guilt and relief plain on her face. The wedding, of course, was canceled. 300 guests went home with a story instead of a marriage, and by Monday morning, half of Manhattan had heard some version of the truth, embellished wildly with each retelling. But in the wreckage of that catastrophic afternoon, something quieter and more real had finally been allowed to breathe. Eleanor Sterling did not apologize easily. It was not in her nature, and 61 years of practiced control did not unravel in a single afternoon. But that evening, as the caterers packed away untouched wedding cake and the last of the guests' cars pulled out of the estate's long driveway, she found Naomi in the kitchen, alone, quietly cleaning up the remains of a celebration that never happened. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor said stiffly, the words clearly costing her something. "I judged you before I ever gave you a chance to be judged fairly. I let my own fear of losing control over this family blind me to the truth in front of me. Isabella fooled all of us. You never tried to fool anyone." Naomi set down the tray she was holding. "Thank you for saying that." "I'm not saying it will be easy," Eleanor continued, some of her old sharpness returning even in contrition. "This family has expectations, standards. If my son intends to pursue whatever this is between you, there will be people who never accept it. I may be one of them, some days. But I will not stand in the way of it with lies and bribes again. You've earned that much at least." It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was a door left open instead of slammed shut, and Naomi understood that from a woman like Eleanor Sterling, that was its own kind of victory. Scarlett's reckoning came differently, quieter, more personal, delivered not in the kitchen but in the garden, the same garden where Alexander and Naomi had once stood too close together beneath a guilty moon. "I'm sorry," Scarlett said simply, finding Naomi there a few days later. "For all of it. The jewelry, the threats, the things I said in the laundry room. I told myself I was protecting my brother, but really, I think I was just cruel, and I let my mother's fear become my own." She paused. "You could have let me stay ignorant this morning. You could have let the wedding happen and let me suffer whatever we deserved for how we treated you. Instead, you told me the truth even though I gave you every reason not to trust me with it." "You're his sister," Naomi said simply. I couldn't let him marry a lie just to punish you for being cruel to me. That's not who I want to be." Scarlett studied her for a long moment, something like genuine respect dawning in her expression for the first time since they'd met. "I think," she said slowly, "that my brother chose better than any of us gave him credit for." Isabella Reyes did not disappear quietly. She tried, in the days that followed, to salvage what remained of her reputation, a tearful interview here, a carefully worded statement there, but the truth, once loose, could not be recaptured. The clinic that had falsified her results lost its license within the month once Renata, driven by guilt and a genuine desire to make things right, cooperated fully with the investigation Alexander's lawyers launched. Isabella herself faced fraud charges that would follow her for years, her name becoming a cautionary tale whispered at the very galas and dinners she had once used as hunting grounds. Renata, for her part, testified against her former friend and, in a strange twist neither of them could have predicted, found an unlikely ally in Naomi, who bore her no ill will for the role she'd played in the deception, understanding that her late confession had likely saved a man from a lifetime bound to a lie. "Why aren't you angry with me?" Renata asked once, in the weeks after everything had settled. "I helped her plan it. I could have come forward sooner." "You came forward," Naomi said simply. "That's what matters. A lot of people never would have." 6 months later, the Sterling estate looked much the same from the outside. The same 11 acres, the same pale stone, the same view of the Hudson River glittering in the afternoon sun. But inside, something fundamental had changed. Naomi no longer wore a maid's uniform. She had, at Alexander's quiet insistence and her own careful, independent decision, enrolled in business courses at Columbia, discovering in herself an aptitude for numbers and negotiation that had been buried for years beneath the exhaustion of survival. Alexander made a point of never rushing her, never pressuring her into a role or a title before she was ready to claim it for herself, understanding, perhaps for the first time in his privileged life, the particular dignity of a person building something with their own 2 hands. Eleanor, true to her word, had not become a different woman overnight, but she had, in her own stubborn way, begun to soften, inviting Naomi to family dinners not as staff but as a guest, asking, once, with visible discomfort, about her mother back in Savannah, and later quietly arranging, without ever admitting to it, a donation to the community center that had raised her. Scarlett and Naomi, unexpectedly, became something close to friends, an alliance forged in the fire of a canceled wedding and a confession that could have gone very differently. And Alexander, who had spent his entire adult life being told what kind of woman belonged beside him, who kind of family he was permitted to build, what kind of love was acceptable for a man of his name, found himself, on a quiet evening in early spring, standing in the same garden where everything had almost gone so terribly wrong, asking Naomi Carter a very different question than the one that had once nearly ruined both their lives. "I don't have a fake pregnancy to convince you with," he said, dropping to one knee, laughter and nerves fighting for control of his voice. "I don't have a family who approved of you from the start, or a story that makes any of this easy. All I have is the truth. I love you. I have loved you since long before I had the courage to admit it, and I don't want to spend one more day pretending otherwise." Naomi, who had once folded his shirts with hidden feelings and answered his midnight questions with careful, guarded honesty, who had endured months of cruelty from a family that thought her unworthy, who had told the truth even when a lie would have been so much easier, looked down at the man kneeling in the grass and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely, unguardedly happy. "Yes," she said, 1,000 times yes. The wedding, when it finally happened, was smaller than the one that never was. No 300 guests, no camera crews stationed at the gates, no falsified paperwork hiding beneath silk and roses. Just family, real family, gathered in that same garden under a sky full of stars. Eleanor gave a toast that surprised everyone, including herself, by ending in tears. Scarlett stood as Naomi's maid of honor, a role she had asked for herself, awkwardly and sincerely, in the months since chaos had cracked open something honest in both of them. Naomi's mother, who had driven up from Savannah with Naomi's little brother in tow, danced with Alexander until her feet ached and her face hurt from smiling. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Alexander pulled his new wife aside, away from the music and the laughter, and pressed his forehead to hers. "No secrets," he said softly. "Not ever again." "No secrets," Naomi agreed. "Just us. Finally. Just us." Outside the gates, the world kept spinning the way it always had, deals closing, headlines shifting, the relentless churn of a city that never paused to notice one particular kind of happiness. But inside those 11 acres, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, a house that had once been full of cruelty and performance had finally, quietly, become a home.